Today in world literature, we turn to Russian fiction. Professor Nikki Stiller begins with an analysis of the significance of Pushkin. She then focuses on the work of Isaac Babel and Tatiana Tolstoyeva, the contemporary writer born in 1951. Babel is considered Russia's most gifted short story writer of the post-revolutionary period. His stories have generated decades of praise for their stylistic precision and for their treatment of the depth of human nature. Born in the Jewish ghetto of Odessa, Babel was educated in traditional Jewish studies. He served in the Russian army during World War I and later as a war correspondent. He rode with the Cossack cavalry against the Poles and the White Tsarist forces, experiences which became important background for his stories. Although his works were praised during the 1920s, they were eventually censored during the Stalinist period. Refusing to write political propaganda in 1934, he declared himself a master of a new literary genre, the genre of silence. He was arrested in 1939 for his criticism of the Stalinist regime in a screenplay he was writing. He is believed to have died in prison in 1941.
Russian prose fiction, since its extraordinary inception in the early 19th century, has reflected the extremes endemic to Russian society: the most outrageous wealth and the most terrible poverty, a worship of the West and a loathing for all it represents, the most exquisite sensitivity to beauty and nature and the most ferocious cruelty, the greatest concern for justice and the most palpable contempt. These are the contradictions of humanity in general. One might say, however, that while everyone is human, the Russians are a little more so. Joseph Brodsky, the embittered and witty émigré poet, once commented that Eastern Europe should really be called Western Asia. What this brings to my mind are the steppes, those vast plains over which various Eastern groups, the Tartars, the Mongols, spread and were both assimilated and repelled. What Brodsky had in mind, however, was the propensity for Eastern despotism and dreaminess, as opposed to the more bourgeois and individualistic vision of Western Europe. East and West, body and soul, heat and the famous Russian cold. How telling that Krasnaya means both red and beautiful in Russian, perhaps the fire of the community as the center of life. Russian fiction draws disparate people to it as surely as a warm stove draws one in on a bitter night. It is both earthy and transcendent. Even the intellectual does not forget the land, the soil of Mother Russia, as black and rich as the delicious peasant bread. The selections in your text are all more or less contemporary, but I cannot tell you how much I want you, when you have the time, to go out and read books like Crime and Punishment, that wild-eyed work about a believer in raw reason, the student Raskolnikov, who commits a murder in order to prove himself superior to his feelings. I want you to read Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, with its insistence that window dressing and keeping up appearances is not the end-all and be-all of existence, but in fact is its antithesis. I want you to read Chekhov's touching and tender Lady with Lapdog, and his less typical but equally inspired Ward 6 about a complacent country doctor who runs a foul lunatic asylum and becomes a patient in it, an allegory about the mental health of a repressive and mendacious society. I want you to see the films of Oblomov and Uncle Vanya for the palpability of their longings and the subtlety of their emotional color. I hope you will go on to read Lermontov and Pushkin, Turgenev, Gogol, Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Tolstoy's War and Peace, and Gorky's My Childhood. To read these works is to lose one's literary and perhaps even spiritual virginity. You will never be the same again. Okay. Before I go on to talk about the works before us, I want to tell you about the great-granddaddy of Russian short stories, and that is Pushkin's The Queen of Spades. Russian fiction took off suddenly at the beginning of the 19th century with the most remarkable figure of Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. He was born in the reign of the repressive Paul I, who closed down the printing presses in Russia and forbade Russians to travel abroad. Pushkin was 13 years of age, a most impressionable time, when Napoleon invaded Russia and was defeated by a combination of Russian heroism and the Russian winter. Although Napoleon was the enemy, he also paradoxically represented the best hope of the intellectuals and liberals. Napoleon spread the ideas of the French Revolution throughout the areas he conquered. Pushkin was thus inspired to write an ode on liberty which came to the attention of the authorities and caused the author to be banished to the south of Russia before his 21st birthday. About 6 years of Pushkin's brief life were spent in exile, and he always felt, even when dancing with his wife at the royal palace, that he was outside the law. This is, of course, not unusual for writers, and again, what is true for humanity is more true for Russians. You will see that Babel, too, is an outsider, and that the writer's love for his country is all the more poignant because of his alienation from it. The Queen of Spades, the Pushkin story, exemplifies the dichotomies I spoke about earlier. In it, a young officer of German descent who resembles Napoleon woos a saintly young woman in order to wrest a gambling secret from the old countess she cares for. The story juxtaposes the Western ideal of the exertion of the will with that of fatalistic abandon. For Pushkin, the exercise of the naked will led Napoleon to Elba and leads the protagonist, Hermann, to madness. His obsession with winning displaces his conscience, and he winds up in a lunatic asylum. The game of life and society goes on as before. The sardonic irony of the aristocrats was replaced after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 by the sardonic irony of the intellectuals, of whom none is more representative than Isaac Babel. My First Goose, as well as many other Babel tales, makes clear the struggle between, as your book puts it, imaginative idealism and corporeal reality, the old body-mind conflict. In this poetic masterpiece, a bespectacled law graduate is put in charge of a group of remarkably coarse and anti-intellectual Cossacks. The Cossacks, a river-dwelling people whom the Russians conquered, had considerable stamina and prowess, which was harnessed by the Tsars and the reactionary and anti-Semitic White Guard army. The Cossacks instilled terror in the hearts of Jews and liberals and came to stand for the epitome of barbaric ferocity and barbarian grace. These Cossacks are red, of course, but we shall be asking whether their barbaric strength is consonant with Leninism and the ideals of the revolution. Let's begin by discussing the title, which refers to an initiatory experience, some kind of ritual by which a young man or woman attains adulthood and membership in a tribe. The "my" is curious here, given the ostensibly collective nature of the revolutionary enterprise. This is, I think, our first inkling that all is not so communal in the communist rank and file. The kind of animal involved in this story is also important. Why a goose? The goose is a stupid and not very violent barnyard animal, a symbol of innocence like the purblind old woman in the story, and like her, a helpless, hapless victim. That this particular narrator achieves manhood in his own eyes and in the eyes of his comrades by killing this creature speaks volumes about the place that bloodshed has acquired in the human hierarchy of values. We start by seeing the commander of the Red Army Division, Savitsky, through the eyes of the narrator. Savitsky, whose name suggests one who is savvy and wise, is presented as having mythic, almost godlike characteristics and proportions. Quote, Savitsky, commander of the 6th Division, rose when he saw me, and I wondered at the beauty of his giant's body. Savitsky is the new hero, the new god, embodiment of the revolution. He is manly and yet graceful, smelling of scent and soap, with, quote, long legs like girls, sheathed to the neck in shining riding boots. He bestrides the little world of the hut, and we soon see that the godlike merriment in his cool gray eyes does not diminish as he deals out death. In the flower and iron of his youthfulness, this revolutionary is as careless as God, and it is this quality, I think, that our insecure narrator so admires. Our intellectual is billeted among the Cossacks, and the first thing that happens to him by way of greeting is that a young peasant lad takes his briefcase full of books and papers and throws it out of the gate, quote, and with remarkable skill emitted a series of shameful noises. In other words, the peasant greets the intellectual with a symphony of gas. our Ivan is reduced to crawling over the ground to retrieve his paper. He must turn his briefcase into a pillow by covering it with hay. An interloper here, now that the huge pumpkin-colored sun of daylight's reason has set, the narrator can no longer read at night from his beloved Lenin. But he is about to lose more than his spectacles. He's going to lose his ideals, too. His own id, a Cossack if there ever was one, is about to get the upper hand. The old woman is trying to spin, that is, endeavoring to carry on with one of the tasks of civilization, while these barbaric men, whites, reds, the whole lot of them, are despoiling her house. She is, in fact, like a Penelope who will never see Odysseus come home. He addresses the old woman in a crude and primitive manner. He is very far from home, lonely, frightened, and famished. "Landlady," he says, "I've got to eat." At this point, he overtakes her goose and crushes its head underneath his boot. Now, the Cossacks, having seen this, stiff as heathen priests, quote, at sacrifice, take him into their circle. Quote, "The lad's all right," said one of them, winking and scooping up the cabbage soup with his spoon. That night, the moon, quote, above the yard hung like a cheap earring, unquote. The narrator is ashamed, and everything seems to him to be upside down. The boy sings with his behind, the briefcase becomes a pillow, the goose's neck is depicted in the dung, and the peasant keeps a spoon in his boot. Of course, in a way, a boot is a very good place to keep a spoon, unless you're concerned about hygiene. But these people are concerned about something more basic, survival. Towards the end, the peasants begin to appear more benign. Once their hunger has been alleviated, they wish to know what's in the newspaper. The very same flaxen-haired lad who made all those shameful sounds asks the narrator to tell them. The narrator reads from the Marxist paper, Pravda, the Truth, and is lulled by the sweet comradeship of these simple men. Both the intellectual narrator and the peasants lie down in the hayloft, like animals, warming one another, without boundaries, quote, legs intermingled, unquote, a strange new kind of creature. The narrator dreams. In his dreams is the natural desire for normal life and the lust for women. But his heart is stained with bloodshed. Our narrator has lost his pure intentions. In this conflict between the savage id and the idealistic ego, the urge to survive prevails, and his heart, that symbol of love and brotherhood, is just another organ in the slaughterhouse. In the Soviet period, writing had meaning. It either celebrated the working class or the revolution, or it stood against them. Now, Russian writers must in a sense be like those in the West, looking for some kind of meaning in life beyond consumerism. In Tatyana Tolstoya, we see some of the qualities that made the writing of her forebears, including Leo Tolstoy, so great. Intensity, passion, the tension between the great fire of life and the dust of death, the pull of extremes, and the examination of great questions even in the transient events of the day. We can also see the extreme emotionality, the fiercely passionate love of the imaginative that so animates Russian poetry and fiction. For Tatyana Tolstoya, however, this divide between creativity and the quotidian cannot be bridged under present conditions. In this apocalyptic fable, an ordinary but intelligent woman named Svetlana dreams of a future when she can decorate her own apartment, vacation in the South, fulfill her longings for a less confined and constricted existence. Playing it safe, she is doing more or less all right materially, unlike her friend, the wild, promiscuous, storytelling Pipka, who is always disappearing with the men, despite her rows of rotten teeth. Svetlana's dreary world, her lazy husband, her communal apartment, the undying old man rooming at the back, is moribund. Notice how all the foods mentioned in this story are tinned or pickled. In other words, though once alive and fresh, they are now preserved. Her days are refreshed from time to time by visits from the histrionic Pipka with her insane fantasies. But in the end, dust prevails, and Pipka's allure is either turned to corruption, profiteering, or conflagration. From this fire, no phoenix will arise. Pipka, the seed of the imaginative life, cannot inspire Svetlana, the land. A grim prognostication for the post-Soviet era.
Tatiana Tolstoya is the great-grandniece of the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy. Her first volume of stories, On the Golden Porch, presents characters who see life as treacherous, mocking, meaningless, alien, yet nevertheless, as she writes, marvelous, marvelous, marvelous. Her work presents a rich tapestry of the diversity of life in contemporary Russia. Professor Stiller tells it that Tolstoy's short story, Fire and Dust, is a grim prognostication for the post-Soviet era. Why is this story a grim foretelling for the post-Soviet era? Officially, the Soviet, that is, the communist era, began to end in European revolutions of 1989. Poland led the way. Stalin had said that introducing communism to Poland was like putting a saddle on a cow. Labor riots had occurred as early as 1956, and in 1988, widespread labor unrest, strengthened by the Solidarity movement's relentless efforts for an elected government, brought in non-communist leaders. In 1989, communism also died in Czechoslovakia. Hungary followed, Poland and Czechoslovakia, and the Berlin Wall, since 1961, the symbol for the line between communism and democracy, was opened in 1990. The question of the early 1990s, then, was if the Soviet Union would follow its former satellites. After all, for most of the 20th century, the country had been under the control of the Communist Party. When the 1917 revolution broke out, workers, soldiers, and peasant councils, and Russian Soviet means council, were formed. In reality, the Soviets were dominated by the Communist Party. Vladimir Lenin, his dates are 1870 to 1924, was the first to take control, followed by Joseph Stalin, dead in 1953. Under Stalin, culture and art were purged in violent campaigns that imposed anti-Western ideology and conformity. Under Stalin's government, Isaac Babel was arrested, and composer Sergei Prokofiev and the film director Sergei Eisenstein were denounced. When Stalin died, the dictatorship he built began to change. Reformer Nikita Khrushchev, 1894 to 1971, argued for innovations. The liberalization, the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union created a mood of cultural introspection. The poet and novelist Boris Pasternak, 1890 to 1960, and winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1958, completed The Great Dr. Zhivago in 1956, and it was published in the West, but not in Russia. Remember, Dr. Stiller wishing that you could read widely in Russian writers, my wish is that you read Dr. Zhivago, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970, published One Day in the Life of Ivan Desenovich in 1962. This novel depicts life in Stalinist concentration camp, an existence to which Solzhenitsyn had been unjustly condemned. But back to the narrative. By 1962, opposition to Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization had become strong, and Leonid Brezhnev, 1906 to 1982, took over the leadership of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev made it clear that further reforms could not be expected. It was under Brezhnev that the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia occurred, an invasion that symbolized the Soviet determinism to maintain the status quo, in which property, including culture, was held by the state. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev launched an era of fundamental reforms, or rather articulated the voice of reforms that had been taking place in the Soviet Union while Brezhnev was busy solidifying power. Gorbachev capitalized on the increasing urban population, the rising standard of living, the increase of formally educated citizens to create real reform. His perestroika, economic reform, permitted free prices and more entrepreneurship for state enterprises. Yet Gorbachev was opposed by those who wanted most reform, by those who wanted a return to the traditional communist state. In 1991, Gorbachev was kidnapped, but the coup failed when Boris Yeltsin rallied Moscow. Yeltsin and his allies declared Russia independent from the Soviet Union. When all the Soviet republics followed, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So, back to Stiller's comment that Tolstoy's short story, Fire and Dust, is a grim prognostication for the post-Soviet era. Is there, we should ask, any hope in this story? For my part, I think there is, but the hope is not simple. the hope rests in the great, vast diversity of the people themselves. And just as we saw, life in the 20th century has been complex for the Russian people, but the power of the people endures, even prevails. Among those most human of people, life continues. A favorite image is that of the exiled Solzhenitsyn returning to Russia in 1994 and traveling across his land by train, preaching rebirth. In the work of Babel and Tolstoy, we are presented with a concise overview of Russian fiction, its concerns, its breadth, its sad hopefulness in this century.